Things I remember strongly is going to college, leaving COB at 19, and one of the first things I did in university was buy every Bob Marley CD and listen to them all, starting with Burning and ending with Confrontation. I think it was either 10 or 12 albums, I can't remember which one. And I think that this is a good moment for us, because I think the story of reggae should inspire us to create our own story and our own legend of our own music. I first met Kwame Dawes at the Miami Book Fair, and I was extremely impressed with this poet. And when I was asked my opinion as to who should be our speaker for this year's Anatol Rodgers, I really didn't hesitate. I recommended Kwame Dawes, because I think he is really the finest poet in English in the Caribbean. Well, you know, he's more than just Caribbean man, but we're going to own him. Caribbean poet today. I mean, obviously there's Walcott and Brathwaite, but I think that given his age and where he will end up, that we will be talking about Kwame Dawes in the same breath, in the same sort of way we talk about those great poets who started in the 1950s. Born in Ghana in 1962, Kwame Dawes spent most of his childhood and early adult life in Jamaica. As a poet, he is profoundly influenced by the rhythms and textures of that lush place, citing in a recent interview his spiritual, intellectual, and emotional engagement with reggae music. His book, Bob Marley, Lyrical Genius, remains the most authoritative study of the lyrics of Bob Marley. His 11th collection of verse, Wisteria, Poems from the Swamp Country, was published in January of 2006. In February 2007, Akashic Books published his novel, She's Gone, and People Tree Books published his 12th collection of poetry, Impossible Flying. His essays have appeared in numerous journals, including Bomb Magazine, the London Review of Books, Granta, Essence, World Literature Today, and Double Take Magazine. In 2007, his 13th book of poems, Gomer's Song, was published on the Black Goat imprint of Akashic Books. Dawes has produced some 20 of his plays over the past 25 years, including, most recently, a production of his musical One Love at the Lyric Hammersmith in London. Kwame Dawes is Distinguished Poet in Residence, Louis Fry Scudder Professor of Liberal Arts, and founder and executive director of the South Carolina Poetry Initiative. He is the director of the University of South Carolina Arts Institute and the programming director of the Calabash International Literary Festival, which takes place in Jamaica in May each year. Kwame Dawes is a regular blogger for the Poetry Foundation, and his blogs can be read at www.poetryfoundation.org. And I'll just share a small snippet of Midland, his book of poetry, and appropriately, interestingly, he's writing about Walcott. I guess he's observing Walcott at work. And he writes, "The smudge of colors spreads and dries in the sun. The pulpy paper sucks in the watercolor, and the cliche of sea and a fresh beach seems too easy for a poem. He has written them all, imagined the glitter and clatter of silver cuirasses, accents of crude Genoese sailors poisoning the air. The sand feeling for the first time the shadow of flag and plumed helmet, this old story of arrival that stirred him as a boy, looking out over the open plains as he cluttered the simple island with the intrigues of blood and heroes, his gray eyes searching out an ancestry beyond the broad laughter and breadfruit common grunts of the fishermen, pickled with rum and the picong of Kaiso, their histories as shallow as the trace of soil at the beach's edge, where crippled corn bushes have sprouted. That was years ago. He has now exhausted the jaundiced language of a broken civilization. These days, he just chips at his epitaph, a conceit of twilights, turning into bare and bleak nights. His paints whistling sparrow songs while blistering in the sun." Kwame Dawes.
Thank you, Ian, for that very generous introduction. Good evening. It's good to be here, and I'm grateful to the college for inviting me to do this lecture. It's a great honor to be able to do so, and I've enjoyed my short time here in the Bahamas. People have been extremely nice to me. Apparently, this is a cultural trait that is cherished and protected, and you do fine with it. Slave driver, the table is turned. Catch a fire, you're gonna get burned. Every time I hear the crack of a whip, my blood runs cold. I remember on the slave ship how they brutalized our very soul. Every time I hear the crack of a whip, my blood runs cold. I remember on the slave ship how they brutalized our very soul. That's Bob Marley in his great song, Catch a Fire. My proposition tonight is basically that this music, called reggae music, its entry into our imaginations, its entry into the world, would precipitate a number of changes in the ways in which the world is understood and the ways in which, particularly the experience of African people in its diaspora, have understood the world in dramatic and meaningful ways. I propose that the work of that music, reggae music, while it's hard to chart, there's simply no question about the changes that have taken place. I can speak very confidently of Jamaica, and I would argue in the rest of the Caribbean and outside of the Caribbean, in the ways in which Africa is perceived and the dynamic of understanding the presence of history in our present moment and its relevance. I moved to Jamaica in 1971. I was moving there from Ghana, having spent a brief time in the UK before moving to Jamaica. Brief time meaning about a year. The truth is that we were supposed to have a brief in-transit stop in England of about 3 weeks, but that got extended to a very interesting year in London, moving from house sit to house sit and all kinds of peculiar situations before we finally landed in Jamaica. The most striking thing about landing in Jamaica, I was probably about 8 or 9 years old at the time, was going to school. I had always thought I spoke English and understood English quite well. It turns out I didn't. At least if I was to accept that the Jamaicans were speaking English. And it was a really interesting task, first of all, to understand what the students were saying in this primary school, Shortwood Primary School, and what the teacher was saying, for that matter. But that became the beginning of an apprenticeship about learning the Jamaican language and understanding it. One of the greatest enjoyments for the students at that school was tied to their absolute fascination that a true blood African was in class with them. This was quite a sensation, actually.